Welcome, everyone. We'll give it a few minutes, let some folks join. Hope everyone's having a great day. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I first would like to welcome everyone and thank you so much for joining us for this webinar this month on blind spots in APAC sourcing, closing the compliance and traceability gaps. We've got a jam-packed and exciting agenda for you all today. And it's going to be packed with sourcing risks, insights on sourcing risks, regulatory realities, and strategies for building resilient compliance programs in the APAC region. There's a lot of valuable information to cover, so let's go ahead and dive right in. A few housekeeping items that I'd like to go through with you. If you want to ask questions during the webinar, please do so by typing your questions into the question box in the Zoom control panel. We'll address those questions at the end of the presentation during our Q&A session. If we don't get to your question at the end of the event, we will follow up with you after the webinar. We will be emailing all registrants a link to download the recording and the webinar slides on Friday morning. So please be on the lookout for those in your inbox. And of course, if you do have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us at marketing@sourceintel.com. So before we jump in, I do want to make sure that everyone knows where to go if you'd like to keep learning about the topics that we're covering today, or you want to explore some other compliance and sustainability topics that we do have in more depth. You can go to our resource center. It's your go-to hub actually for on-demand regulatory education. You'll find regulatory blogs, ebooks, webinars on demand. You can also subscribe to our quarterly newsletter to help you stay ahead of upcoming changes. And of course, if you do want a more structured learning experience and the ability to earn IACET continuing education credits, you can go to Source Academy at academy.sourceintelligence.com. And Source Academy is a wonderful way to listen to a variety of regulatory topics. You can build your own expertise and get certified along the way. So feel free to check those resources out if you do want some additional education. So what we're going to be covering today, we'll go ahead and start with some key materials and industries that really make APAC such a critical hub for global supply chains. We're going to unpack the region's compliance complexities, from diverse legal frameworks to constantly shifting regulations. We'll then explore the compliance and traceability risks that often create blind spots in APAC sourcing. And finally, we'll share how Source Intelligence and Sayari help close those gaps with the data, technology, and workflows companies need to make confident sourcing decisions. So who are the panelists? We do have Travis Miller. He is our Chief Strategy Officer and General Counsel here at Source Intelligence. He brings more than 20 years of expertise in compliance, sustainability, and legal risk. Travis most recently served as Google's head of supply chain compliance and brings a unique perspective to Source Intelligence as a former user of our CMAP technology. Next, we have Frederick Ho. Frederick currently serves as Vice President of APAC at Sayari, where he focuses on establishing the company's presence in the region and addressing the challenges businesses face in navigating complexities of global trade due to evolving geopolitical dynamics. Previously, Frederick served as Vice President of APAC at Jumio, a global leader in online identity verification and eKYC solutions. And last, you have Teresa Newton. I'm going to be the moderator for today's session. I'm an account executive here at Source Intelligence. I partner with global organizations to identify and mitigate sourcing risks, navigate complex regulatory requirements, and implement effective compliance strategies that drive resilience and operational excellence. So we're thrilled to have you join us today. And to go ahead and get started, I'm going to pass it over to Travis to discuss pre-market analysis.
Yep. Absolutely, and I also share the good advantage of being a former Sayari user, where I helped select the product, across Google when we were doing some of the initial campaigns and evaluations for the best sub-tier mapping solution. So, I'm a big fan, Frederick, and looking forward to the conversation today. All right, so as we get started, let's really think about Asia Pac. Asia Pac is not a singular market. Much more, the best way I think about it is as an integrated regional market with a couple very key materials and industries that require interrelationships, very dynamic flows and commerce activities so that we can produce the electronics, specifically semiconductors, batteries, high-end electronics and goods, garments and textiles, whether that be clothing, fabric, rugs, dyes, and all of the regional critical minerals, whether those be rare earths, copper, electronic components and materials that are necessary to really keep the world operating and functioning. Now, when we talk about regional complexity, I mean there are dozens of legal systems and enforcement approaches that exist across the region. There are language and documentation challenges related to how you can import, how you can transship, how you can move materials and products, and interconnected supplier networks that have been built across decades of time with people transacting, getting to know each other, building the firm relationships that allow them to have reliant dependencies upon one another. And then lastly, we're also faced with emerging Western regulatory scrutiny that has come in the form of sub-tier mapping, looking at Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act or UFLPA concerns, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBOM, or the European Union Deforestation Regulation, all of which are driving at the same core challenge. How is it that we can cast a light into some of the opaqueness, or we're not able to see when we get into the second, third, fourth, or fifth tier supply chains? Now, along those lines, if you think about the economic drivers, why is this happening right now? It really goes down to this fundamental reality that there is a core imbalance between the spending and the manufacturing that is occurring. So when I say spending, I'm generally talking about consumer spending, the economy where the most amount of purchasing power is occurring. And in that light, the United States far outstrips every other country in the world by a large margin. Now, when we start to think about the other major Western economies, whether it's Germany, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, or Canada, this combined purchasing power is driving a lot of the necessary manufacturing operations that are occurring in Asia Pac. And when we talk about Asia Pac and globally, the highest manufacturing output is located in China, with Japan, India, South Korea all bringing up these additional activities and being fueled by large scale industrial and resource driving economies like Brazil and Mexico, who are all supporting these interdependencies to be able to produce the quantity of goods that are desired by those high consumer spend countries. Now, this east west divide has created the complexity that's going to be the hallmark of our story today. And it really has formed the basis of what we now call supply chain risk management, where there's become a larger Venn diagram of overlap between not just identifying the geopolitical risks, but also understanding how that relates to compliance and environmental, social, and governance concerns, the business continuity management, the third party risk management, the logistics management, the commodity risk management, and the overarching compliance frameworks that have been established through regulations, which are those divergent political and economic philosophies. They can come into contrast sometimes and generate a lot of the conflict that we hear about in the trade wars. Production, the physical locations and the geographies where this manufacturing occurs. And there's discrepancies or differences of opinion on how that production should occur and who should be doing it. And then lastly, the logistics. How do we move the volume of commerce, the volume of goods and resources and services that are necessary to allow the largest consumer markets, which often are located in Western economies, to do business with the largest producer economies? which tend to be located in Asia. Now, at its core, the regulation set that we are encountering, whether that be extended producer responsibility, the Toxic Substance Control Act, SCIP, Ross, conflict minerals, modern slavery rules, whether it's UFLPA, LKSG, CSRD, Prop 65, restricted substance specification, POPs, PFAS, obsolescence management, or even audit management, are all intended to accomplish the same singular activity: being able to create transparency from the reporting obligations that we incur through our filings, digital product passport initiatives, and customs declarations throughout the products, the assemblies, the components, the materials, the processing, and the extractive layers. That, at its core, is the codification of sub-tier mapping obligations that drives most of the work that both Sayari and Source Intelligence are doing these days. Now, with that said, let me hand it back over to you, Teresa. Tell us a little bit about this opportunity and why we should be excited.
Yes, thank you, Travis. So I'm going to portray a fictitious company, right? So just to kind of walk through the narrative here, to give you some background, I'm an executive at a consumer electronics company based here in the United States. So after a recent trip to Sydney and years of both living and visiting several countries in Asia, I've seen firsthand the region's rich natural resources, its vibrant markets, and extraordinary opportunities. So during my most recent visit, I was particularly struck by Asia's manufacturing capabilities and vast market potential. So for my company, Asia represents a gateway to growth, a chance to expand sourcing, drive innovation, and strengthen our supply chain. However, I quickly realized that doing business in Asia comes with complex regulatory requirements, anywhere from product certifications and environmental standards to import-export rules. So these realities, they have to be carefully managed in order to ensure successful expansion. And if you take a look at this graph, it's extremely compelling when you look at trade partnerships and how it relates to my fictitious company. China's now become the largest trade partner for 124 countries, and the United States holds that for just 56 countries. So this is a shift, and it shows the true scale of Asia's economic influence and its central role in global supply chains. So for my fictitious US based company, it takes a real live implication firsthand of what the enormous potential could be with both outsourcing and sourcing hub as a customer base. So it does highlight just the competitive reality that operating in Asia means navigating these trade environments where China has deeply established ties with many of our potential partners and suppliers. So, what does that mean when I look at Asia for my potential growth opportunities? Whether it's sourcing innovation or market expansion, if we're entering a complex ecosystem, how do I manage it? Do I need to recognize not only the opportunities, but the competitive pressures and regulatory landscapes that come with it? The success that I would have in Asia truly does depend on balancing these realities and leveraging US strengths while also building resilient and compliant supply chains that can thrive in this environment. So, who do I need on my team? You've just seen the global trade landscape is incredibly complex, especially when working in APAC. And navigating this environment successfully requires more than just strong sourcing and supply chain management. It requires the right partners and the right guidance. When entering new markets, companies need a guide who goes beyond transactional support. They need someone who speaks multiple languages to break down those barriers and ensure smooth communication. They also need someone who understands the culture and language and also the law in Asia, and someone who has deep regulatory knowledge because the biggest risks in APAC expansion are often compliance related. So the combination of expertise allows companies like ours to enter APAC markets with confidence and knowing we can meet regulatory requirements, avoid some costly missteps, and build trust with local partners. With this type of guidance, companies often underestimate the complexity of certification, labor laws, import and export regulations, and that can stall growth before it begins. So that's where Sayari and Source Intelligence comes in play. Together, we provide the cross-regional expertise to cut through complexity and guide companies toward compliant, sustainable growth in APAC. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Frederick, who will dive deeper into compliance and traceability gaps.
Thank you, Teresa. I think at this point, let's talk about the real pain point, the compliance and traceability gaps companies face across APAC supply chains. We all know that sourcing in this region offers tremendous opportunity, but with opportunity comes complexity. Regulations like the UFLPA, EU's deforestation rules, and new ESG disclosure mandates are no longer limited to Tier 1 suppliers. They demand visibility into the entire supply chain custody. The challenge is that most companies still rely on self-reported supplier declarations and manual audits. These methods are not only expensive, but often incomplete or inaccurate, especially in regions where language barriers, opaque registries, and fragmented documentations are the norm. This gap creates risks on multiple fronts: reputational, financial, regulatory. A single misconnection to a high-risk supplier, whether it's a textile mill linked to a forced labor or a smelter tied to a sanctioned ownership, can cause shipments to be detained, contracts to be lost, or brands to be damaged. So this is the critical question. How do companies build a line of sight into Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers without relying solely on what suppliers declare? That's the problem Sayari and Source Intelligence are solving together, helping organizations uncover those blind spots and close the traceability gap with technology and authoritative data. So the purpose of what we're doing is not just about checking a compliance box. It's about protecting the integrity of global trade. Let me illustrate this with an example. Since the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act came into effect, US Customs has detained thousands of shipments, many worth millions of dollars. And that's what's striking is the most important part of detections involve goods where the forced labor links were buried deep into upstream supply chain, invisible to traditional due diligence. And this is where Sayari comes in. Our mission since 2014 has been to give both regulators and businesses the same level of visibility into global supply chains. We combine government source data, ultimate beneficial ownership records, global trade flows, so that companies can see the full network of commercial relationships. That means you're not just identifying direct suppliers, but you're spotting the hidden entities, the mills, the brokers, the shell companies that could expose you to regulatory enforcement. So we talk about purpose. It's bigger than compliance. It's about enabling resilient, ethical, and sustainable trade networks. That's why we've partnered with Source Intelligence, because together we can address two sides of the coin: Source with product compliance and responsible sourcing, and Sayari with global corporate and trade network intelligence. This combined approach helps organizations not just to react to regulations, but to stay ahead of time. For those of you who are new to Sayari, let me just give you a quick overview. Sayari is a global risk intelligence company headquartered in Washington, D.C. We serve governments, financial institutions, and multinational corporations, all of whom share a common challenge: uncovering hidden risks in the supply chain and counterparties. What sets us apart is how we bring the data together. Unlike tools that just provide corporate registry checks or basic sanctioning screenings, Sayari uniquely integrates corporate ownership records, trade and shipping data, beneficial ownership details, and structured risk networks, all in one platform. This combination allows us to identify risks like transshipment, shell companies, and hidden state ownership that traditional tools can't catch. Ultimately, Sayari's mission is simple: to solve the hidden risk problem in global supply chains by providing unmatched visibility into ownership, trade networks. We empower you to meet regulatory requirements, protect your brand, and ensure the integrity of your global operations. Let's talk about risk analytics, which really is at the heart of how Sayari helps organizations move beyond list-based screening. So traditional compliance systems ask, is this entity on a sanctions list? But the reality is far more complex. A company might not appear on the list, but yet still be majority owned by a sanctioned entity under OFAC's 50% rule, or a supplier may not declare forced labor links, but trade records show that they source inputs from a high-risk region. Sayari provides more than 100 structured risk indicators across 7 categories: sanctions, forced labor, export control, ESG, political exposure, and adverse media, and more. That means you can instantly assess whether a supplier is connected to state ownership, dual-use goods, or high-risk jurisdictions. It's not just about the indicator itself, it's about the evidence. Every risk signal is tied back to the original government document, making your assessments auditable and defensible in front of regulators. And this is crucial in today's fast-changing environment, where new rules like EU's 14th sanction package or the EUDR can come into effect almost overnight. In practice, risk analytics helps compliance sourcing teams quickly triage thousands of suppliers, flagging the high-risk ones for deeper review while clearing the low-risk efficiently. It's the difference between spending months in manual checks and being able to act with confidence in minutes. Let's look at one of the Sayari's flagship solution, which is the Sayari Graph. So the graph is built for deep investigations and due diligence. It allows you to navigate pre-computed networks of ownership, trade flows, and financial ties across jurisdictions. Instead of looking at suppliers in isolation, you see the entire connected network: who owns whom, who trades with them, and where hidden risks may lie. For example, let's say you're reviewing a Southeast Asian electronic supplier. On the surface, nothing seems wrong. But with Graph, you can see the 2 layers up is linked to a Chinese defense state-owned enterprise on the US BIS entity list. That's the kind of exposure that can trigger enforcement action. And without Graph, you likely miss it. What makes Graph especially powerful is that it combines risk factors like sanctions, forced labor, ESG, with visualization and translation tools. That means you can investigate across languages, jurisdictions, data silos, and with ease. And because every link is backed by original source documents, you can stand behind your findings with confidence. In short, Sayari Graph transforms investigation work that you need to do from a manual, weeks-long process into a scalable, defensible workflow. It gives you compliance and sourcing teams the ability not just to react to risks, but to proactively uncover and address them before they impact your business. Now that we have looked at the Sayari Graph and what it does, let's go just a level deeper into the risk factor it incorporates. Graph is not just about drawing pictures of company connections, right? It makes powerful the ability to layer structured risk intelligence directly onto those networks. For example, as you're tracing ownership across borders, the platform automatically highlights if one of the shareholder is a sanctioned individual, or if the company has directors who are politically exposed persons. The system is pre-computed, which means that you're not starting from scratch each time. You're immediately navigating through cross-border ownership and trade networks, with risk factors baked in at covering everything from sanctions and export control, to forced labor, ESG violations, corruption, and adverse media. So instead of just mapping a corporate tree, you're seeing a live risk map. And importantly, every node and every relationship in Graph is backed by an original source document, registry, customs data, financial disclosures. So this is what makes the platform auditable and defensible. Let me give you a real-world example. A client using Graph to vet a supplier in Southeast Asia. On the surface, the company looked clean, but following the ownership chain 2 steps up, Graph revealed that it was controlled by an entity in Russia that appeared on EU's sanctions list. But because the risk factor was flagged instantly, the client was able to terminate the contract before exposure occurred. So Graph doesn't just help you connect the dots, it helps you to prioritize the right risks, focus on what matters most, and ensure that your due diligence goes beyond surface level checks. Following this, I'd like to invite everyone to take a look at a demonstration of how the Sayari Graph tool works.
Begin your supply chain risk management workflow by uploading a supplier list to Sayari. Sayari will instantly match your entities against its database and automatically identify risk related not only to the uploaded entities themselves, but also to their upstream supply chains. Begin narrowing your analysis here in the list view, or click into an entity to see a multi-tier map of its upstream supply chain. Full supply chain maps display all products and components flowing through a supplier for all time. Filter the map by product and shipment date to see only relevant upstream suppliers. Adjudicate risk by inspecting its source and exploring other alerts linked to the entity. Information can be translated to facilitate cross-border investigations. View network visualizations to better understand entity connections. This workflow, from upload to visualization, takes less than 10 minutes. Report on your findings by downloading entity dossiers. Annotate graphs to highlight key insights. Coordinate with your team by tracking case histories. Be automatically alerted to changes in an entity's risk status.
All right. Thank you for the demo there, Frederick. Very, very insightful information. I'd like to go ahead and pass it over to Travis to talk through a little bit more about how Source Intelligence can help with navigating the APAC region.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Teresa. So as you can see with your company, trying to get into Asia Pac requires a level of insights, knowledge, and due diligence that really has never been encountered, previously or historically. Me personally, what I love about the Sayari Graph product is that it's independent. It's using big data analytics that exist that are in the public domain. It grants incredible insights that really were only available to the government. And that's really where Sayari got started, like having that government level knowledge, that insight that was available for your company as you try to navigate some of these barriers. But let's pivot a little bit because at some point, the big transition that you're going to encounter is, but what about my products? Right, Teresa? Like, how does this impact me and my things? Not just the entity list, not just the parties, but is there actually something that I have to deal with in my widget, in the unit that I'm trying to source or buy? And that's where source intelligence kicks in. Because if you think about source intelligence, what makes it different? Like, what makes it special when you kind of get into the world? And it really boils down to this. It's one simple reason, and that's completeness. There's not another provider that can look at all of the environmental product compliance obligations, looks at all the raw materials, does the traceability for every single component down to the gram, to the unit of measure, to the percentage concentration, which is what's being obligated by REACH, by PFAS, by the GADSL list, by the SCIP, by the US TSCA, the PFAS requirements, and combines all the extended producer responsibility and waste stream. So just with those two applications, you've got the entire end of life from the product's inception till its end of life. And when we talk about end of life, we have to talk about component obsolescence. How do you find a replacement? How would you transition your company, Teresa, from a Western based manufacturing base to incorporating some Asia based suppliers? You would have to find a way to end of life that part or that component or that supplier or find alternatives that might be available if the converse was to happen. And then lastly, there's an obligation to actually communicate with the suppliers to acquire some of that knowledge or information from them. And that is the requirements of the EUDR, human rights laws, minerals due diligence, all that sub tier activity that requires engagement. So, this is where that combination becomes extraordinarily powerful. It makes you regulatory ready because when you're challenged and you can combine the independence and the knowledge of Sayari with the specificity of how that applies to your products, you're in a league of your own and you'll be able to survive any level of regulatory scrutiny that comes at you. So, what's the alternative? And at its core, the cost of not doing this, the cost of not keeping up is existential. So, what do I mean by that? Each of these headlines came out of the news in the last 12 months. We're talking about tens of billions of dollars with the fines and settlements. There hasn't been a more litigated chemical regulation since asbestos, as opposed to what's happening right now with the PFOA of PFAS. Companies are having to deal with not just the former 3TG and the Dodd-Frank laws for conflict minerals, but the new EU battery directive, which is coming into effect, the timber regulations, which are transitioning to deforestation, looking at what's going to happen with digital product passport. These are all reporting obligations that require the combination of knowledge and visibility and stakeholder engagement, which is what we're talking about here. And as the retailers, the manufacturers, the consumer goods, the SEC, and the lawyers are all getting engaged together, that's where the partnership can come and be its strongest. Now, along those lines, really, the risks that you'll face as you go down this journey, and you start thinking about how your company can best engage in these markets, is you have to think about 6 key things. What's the revenue? Because if you're not increasing your revenue, why do it? It's not going to support you. The second becomes the budget. Are you going to spend more than you make? It's just like our household checkbook at the end of the day. Third, the resources. Can you find the right people that can guide you through this, and what's it going to cost to maintain them and to keep them in the organization and avoid a single point of failure as you build up this new enterprise? Then it'll be the penalties. What happens if you get caught not complying? What would that cost look like? Are you in that $10.3 billion 3M range, or is it something significantly less? And then if you do get associated with forced labor or a chemical that causes cancer, what's going to happen to your brand? Is anybody ever going to trust you again and want to buy your products? And then lastly, think about some of those names that just ring true to you. If I say Patagonia, what do you think of? And you probably have a real positive image, a real positive feeling. And that's because that's a company that really took responsibility to heart. The way they make things, the way that they operate, what they do with their investments. That market leadership has a true value, something that can contribute to the goodwill and your valuation. So combining those, we then get faced with the how. How can we be pragmatic in this world that's evolving and moving so fast? And to Source Intelligence, we got really pragmatic about AI. That's what's allowed us to hit a whole new growth trajectory that we never had before. And if you think about what's happening in the world, like we recently saw MIT studies and other evaluations showing that 95% of AI investments and projects in the corporate world are failing to generate an ROI. They're not profitable. So what do you have to do to make sure that yours are? And at the end of the day, you got to focus on the boring stuff. And the boring stuff is finding out the part data that's already out there in the market. It's going through the quality control procedures. It's being able to interact with your supply chain, with campaign management, and then combining all of that activity into agentic workflows. Systems that can operate independently, that can be flexible, that can adapt. And that's really what the platform does best. It allows you to automate the arduous. I like to think of us as the plumbing that sits in the base of the house. Whenever you're building a new house, the first thing you do is you connect to the sewer, you connect to the water lines, you connect to the actual plumbing infrastructure. It's going to sit there before you even pour the concrete foundation. And the reason for that is that if that doesn't happen, if you can't have that flow, it's just a pretty box. It delivers no value if the house doesn't have water or if you can't get rid of waste. And that infrastructure is so critical to be able to build up something that's sustainable that can operate for the future. Now, along those lines, I want to talk to you just a second about what that infrastructure looks like and how it feels. And I want to paint a picture for you about what your business might be able to have as you endeavor on this journey. So, the first thing, let's really think about core data. Like, what is it that allows your systems and your business to run? And I always like the adage, the best run businesses in the world run SAP. That's true. It's an enterprise resource planning system that dictates who you can buy from and what. And if you don't have that in place, you don't have clean data. Now, when you go even a little bit further to the left, let's just shift that left. Even before you decide who you're going to buy from, you have to know what you're trying to build. That's a product lifecycle management system. And I know like your company might operate with a PTC Windchill, great partner of ours. You can integrate with them, whether that be Oracle, Team Center, all those capabilities which are the master data, what it is that keeps your business running. CMAP shines by being that middleware that pulls all that information together and creates the interfaces for your product compliance team, for your suppliers, for the supplier hub, for the communications that you need, that can publish data so you can actually do the reporting, that could consolidate all of that compliance infrastructure and give you the external system connections and controls that you need to publish this data into all the regulatory websites and databases that you're going to have to operate with or that you already are. Now, in so doing, we recognize that we can't be the master of all things. We can't get every piece of data on the planet, but we know the guys that can. And when we talk about Sayari, they're the best in the business when it comes to managing trade data, that opaqueness, the sub-tier mapping, finding out who those beneficial owners are. I know that because I looked at every vendor out there. I ran an RFQ that went through nearly 100 different vendors in the market in this space, and we picked Sayari as number one. So to me, when I see that level of insight, that level of capability, and I can link it to my things, the things that you're manufacturing and producing, that's when you generate real impact, real value to the business. By being able to say, I've taken the world's knowledge and I've applied it to what it is that I make. So with that said, I'd like to vision cast for you for just a minute and show you, or better yet, I'll have my AI friend show you exactly how Source Intelligence and Sayari could help you and your company achieve its goals.
Hello, and thanks for joining today's webinar. I am going to give a quick demo of the Source Intelligence CMAP platform with the Sayari graph integration. In today's digital manufacturing landscape, a digital bill of materials is a foundational step in understanding product composition. When integrated with a customer's product life cycle management system and enterprise resource planning tools, this process becomes seamless and dynamic. Each assembly and sub-assembly is broken down into its constituent parts and materials, revealing a hierarchical structure that mirrors the actual product. This integration ensures real-time synchronization between design, procurement, and production data as the bill of materials is exploded. Metadata such as part numbers, quantities, sourcing details, and revision histories enable traceability and version control. This granular visibility is essential for downstream compliance, cost analysis, and risk management. The next critical step is gathering material content information. This data is sourced from internal records, supplier declarations, and third-party databases. With this comprehensive data set, companies can assess global compliance requirements across jurisdictions. Regulations like REACH in the EU and the PFAS rules in the US require precise material-level insights. Source Intelligence maps each material to its regulatory status, import restrictions, and reporting obligations, ensure products meet legal thresholds and avoid costly delays and penalties. This same data foundation is repurposed to meet emerging digital product passport requirements, enabling transparent, machine-readable documentation that travels with the product across borders. To take compliance and risk management even further, the Compliance Map application can be integrated with Sayari to expand bottom-up mapping capabilities. This integration allows companies to trace raw material suppliers through complex multi-tier supply chains, grounding risk assessments and actual bills of materials using bulk loading APIs. Source Intelligence can ingest large data sets and enable dynamic data pulls from Sayari to enrich the supply chain map with corporate ownership, trade data, and geopolitical risk indicators. Together, these tools provide a powerful lens into where risk truly lies, whether it's a restricted substance buried deep in a sub-tier supplier's formulation or a sourcing dependency tied to a high-risk region or entity. Like this example of core mining. This fusion of structured bill of materials data and dynamic supply chain intelligence empowers proactive decision-making and resilient product stewardship. Collectively, The dynamic combination of the Source Intelligence CMAP platform and Sayari combine the essential elements companies need to succeed and thrive in the modern regulatory landscape. That concludes our demo of the CMAP platform with the Sayari integration. Now over to Teresa for final thoughts followed by audience questions.
Right. Thank you so much for that demo, Travis. That was amazing. So now, just some final thoughts that I'd like to talk through with you. We've seen sourcing in APAC as both just a tremendous opportunity and a real challenge. So it brings complex regulations, hidden risks, and rapidly evolving requirements. So the good news is that companies don't have to navigate this alone. With partners like Source Intelligence, which provides complete solutions across product compliance, EPR, responsible sourcing, and obsolescence, but also with Sayari that brings deep APAC expertise, businesses can move forward with confidence, compliance, and resilience. So I'm excited to really enter the APAC region with my product. I think with Source Intelligence and with Sayari behind me, I'm going to go into the market with flying colors. So I'm excited. So thank you so much, both everyone for participating. We've covered a lot of ground, and I know it's a very complex topic that has many different layers. Let's turn over to some of the questions that came in from the audience. We'll go ahead and go through them now. All right, the first one is many of the forced labor risks in APAC are buried deep in tier 2 or tier 3 suppliers, particularly in textile electronics and palm oil. How can companies realistically uncover these hidden connections when supplier declarations are often incomplete or falsified?
I can take that question, Teresa. That's an excellent question because it gets to the heart of the challenge with forced labor risks in APAC. The truth is, most companies have very limited visibility beyond their tier 1 suppliers, and questionnaires or audits only give a partial and sometimes misleading picture. So this is where Sayari makes a difference. Instead of relying on what suppliers tell you, we use government source data and real trade records to map the actual upstream networks. For example, if a textile factory in Vietnam is importing cotton yarn, and Sayari shows you where the yarn originated, perhaps back in the mill in China, and even further upstream into Xinjiang. By combining ownership records with shipment data, we are able to highlight the hidden tier 2 or tier 3 suppliers that may never appear in your direct contracts, but are still part of your product's supply chain. This gives your company the ability to act on the data that they can, rather than declarations that may be incomplete or falsified. So the realistic way to uncover these risks is not through more questionnaires, but really through independent document-backed visibility across the entire supply chain. That's what Sayari delivers.
Thank you for that insight, Frederick. Very insightful. Let's take another question from the group. What value does integrated environment product compliance, also EPC, and full material declaration data bring to sub-tier mapping work?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So if you think about what those things are, those data sets are, the product lifecycle management is the what. It's the what you're trying to build. It is the product. It is the assembly. It is the manufactured part that goes into the assembly. It is the subpart, which at its core is really the framework for a sub-tier map. Because I'm not looking at who you're trading with, I'm looking at what you're getting from that person. It could very well be the case that you have a conglomerate or you have a manufacturer who might be producing both textiles and electronics in various factories. Now, if all I did was consider that that entity might be at risk of trading or have a sub-part manufacturer in the textile space, I might inadvertently think that they're a concern, even though what I or what you're actually buying, in the case of our fact pattern, Teresa, is a piece of electronics. So by having the PLM and the FMD, which looks at the chemical composition, the materials, and actually even down to the minerals, like where something was sourced from the ground, by having that data, I can rule out those false positives. I can say that's actually not a concern. Because even though there might be a history or a transaction that would generate a concern or a sub-tier entity that might be risky for me, I would know that it's not relevant for my specific product lines because what I purchased was this. So that's really the secret sauce. It's how you can have all that information that Frederick talks about, like the magic of Sayari, having all that data and then anchoring it to exactly what it is that you're making and where that information is coming from. Hope that helps.
It does, Travis. Thank you for that. So, sticking with the theme of supply chain complexity, here's another one. How can I improve the accuracy of detecting sub-tier risk? I get a lot of high-risk entity hits that I cannot link to my product. How do I solve that?
I'll carry on with that one too. So more data is not always better data. So what you need to do is you need to be very clear and have alignment on what you're trying to accomplish. In my opinion, this is actually the number one area where most AI projects fail. It's misalignment. People don't start with an understanding of what they're trying to accomplish. And if you start with, say, that anchor information, the PLM and the FMD data that we were talking about, and then you say, from here, I want to identify the specific supplier of this copper that went into this wire, that found its way into this diode, that went into this power supply, that was on this motherboard, that found its way into my laptop that I'm looking at right now today. If I start with that frame of mind, my queries become incredibly efficient. I don't comb through and return more information than I need. I get precise. And I can make sure that my prompt, my due diligence, like the data combing that I'm doing, is relevant to exactly the answer that I seek. So that to me is where you need to go to be able to remove some of that false hits. You can't just start and say, I'm going to look through everything, because then you're going to find everything, even things that might not be exactly what you're asking. So at the end of the day, it's strategy. It's alignment at the beginning that yields the best result at the end.
Got it. Thank you for that. That's really great perspective, Travis. Let's build on it with another question we've received. In Asia, many suppliers have links to state owned or military industrial entities that may not appear on first level screening. How do companies avoid inadvertently sourcing from or selling to restricted parties or sanctioned networks?
I have a case to share, Teresa. This is another common challenge, especially in Asia, where state-owned enterprises and military-linked companies play a significant role in industries like steel, semiconductor, and logistics. The issue is that these entities don't always appear directly. They might be 2 or 3 layers removed through subsidiaries or joint ventures. Sayari addresses this by performing multi-hop ownership tracing. Our system automatically identifies if a supplier is majority owned, even indirectly by a sanctioned party, which is critical under rules like OFAC's 50% or EU's control tests. For example, you may have a trading partner in Southeast Asia that looks fine on paper, but when Sayari maps the ownership chain, it reveals the company is ultimately controlled by a Chinese defense SOE, that's restricted. So without that visibility, you could easily miss the exposure and inadvertently violate sanctions. So the key takeaway is avoiding sanction or restricted networks requires going beyond first level screening. With Sayari, you can see the complete network of ownership and trading activity, so you can make confident sourcing decisions and avoid costly regulatory penalties.
Thank you for that, Frederick. Very informative. Here's another one that just came in. Is there a way to identify hidden sub-tier supplier risks that do not appear on trade records?
Boy, that one's right in between us. Maybe we'll both give that one a crack, Frederick. um, so, in my perspective, the answer would be yes. Yeah, I would port to a couple examples that you tend to encounter pretty regularly. One such example might be a conflict minerals report. So, a conflict minerals report is asking the question of your first tier suppliers to look back to all of their cascade of suppliers that came before. All the way back to the very first materials that came out of the ground. The same thing is going to be true of the EU DR, the deforestation regulation, as we start to look at the timber and the you know cattle and the various other materials that exist. In all of these cases, there's a data set that actually never appears in a trade inventory because a lot of those materials are going to move inter-country. They're not going to exist in a cross-border transaction, but the data does exist. It's flowing through these different compliance documentation packages that we've been trading for years and years. And really, in my opinion, it's the untapped source of intelligence. See what I did there? Of information that is available to you that we're just starting to scratch the surface to detect the value that it can bring. What say you, Frederick? This is your space.
I think that's absolutely true as well, Travis. I think that with officially sourced data that Sayari provides, gives a level of visibility, and I think that is the combination of multiple sources of information that will really guide and reduce time to actually take decisive actions on certain risks that can be illuminated by Sayari.
Amazing.
Thank you both for that. We've had some fantastic questions today. Let's take one or two more before we wrap up. Supply chains in APAC change rapidly. Ownership shifts, licenses get revoked, and new sanctions appear. How can compliance teams keep up without spending months manually checking every supplier?
We are sitting in a very big moment of change, and that's really affecting. In fact, it's probably at the core of today's discussion as well, right? So you're absolutely right. The supply chains in APAC are dynamic. Ownership structures change overnight, licenses are revoked, and new sanctions can appear with little notice. A one-time check during onboarding is no longer enough, and traditional supply chain maps may no longer even be relevant. Right? That's why we emphasize on continuous monitoring. With Sayari, you can set up automated workflows that can screen suppliers, that networks on an ongoing basis. For example, if a supplier that was cleared last quarter suddenly becomes linked to a newly sanctioned parent, the system flags it immediately, so no manual rechecking is required. So this not only saves months of manual work, but also ensures that you are aligned with regulators' expectations for proactive compliance. So it makes the compliance function far more scalable because you are monitoring hundreds or thousands of suppliers simultaneously without needing to add headcount. So in other words, continuous monitoring is the only realistic way to keep up with today's regulatory pace. And Sayari provides that infrastructure to make that possible in a cost-effective, automated way. I hope that answers the question.
It does, Frederick. Thank you. Thank
I'm
you.
just happy you answered the question.
Finish with this question, since it's something many companies are just trying to get wrap their head around. What is a full material declaration, and why would
Yeah.
this be useful to sub-tier visibility?
We probably should have started with that. But now that I think about it, is a lot of what we've been talking about in demo is these full material declarations. So, okay. So if you think about it, every widget that you have, let me just take for example this little screw that I have here. Uh, that little screw is not just one thing. It's a composition of different materials and chemicals that have come together to create an alloy. And then that alloy has been molded into something special. A little screw that I can, put into my desk, right down here. It could be an ink that I get to put into my pen. It could be a supercomputer in a data center. What an FMD is it's the recipe book. It's how you bake the cake. It's the materials that went into that alloy, the chemical composition that went into that resin, that plastic, that epoxy, in enough granularity so that you can identify what they are and where they came from. So the FMD at its core is really the first stage of really understanding the origin of everything that you have in a product. And in my opinion, it's the core linkage that's going to enable EUDR, UFLPA, the digital product passport. It's having that recipe book so you know where to anchor your due diligence as you kind of stream out to conduct and figure out who and where it came from.
Yeah, you're right, Travis. We should have started with that question. But these questions come up. You can't tell what's going to happen next. So, well, I think that wraps up our webinar for today. I want to thank everyone for attending. We really do hope that you found it valuable, informative, and insightful like I did. So lastly, I do want to say that your feedback is incredibly valuable to us. It helps us to improve future webinars and ensure we're delivering the right content for you. Please take a moment to scan the QR code on your screen and share your thoughts with us. On behalf of Travis, Frederick, and the entire Source Intelligence team, thank you for your time today. We look forward to seeing you at our next session. Have a great afternoon.
Take care.
Bye.